All right, energy independence and transportation go hand in glove here. Joining Morning Rush to discuss where the nation is on both of those topics, we welcome to Morning Rush the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for taking the time out today, pretty early in the morning. So my first question for you is, you have been a vocal advocate of electronic vehicles, and long term, yes, that may be an answer to high gas prices. But man, are people struggling to fill up their tanks? I mean, I know some people that literally can only afford to put $20 and it doesn't get them very far. So what can be done now? Because people are struggling now to relieve the pain at the pump that we're feeling.
Well, that's right. Today, most Americans don't have an electric vehicle, and that's not going to change overnight. So we're feeling that pain at the pump. Look, when a major oil-producing nation gets into a war, there will be consequences for global oil markets. It's one of the reasons why the president has taken some of the actions that are available to help to blunt the impact of some of those shocks. Things like working with other partner nations to release 60 million barrels from strategic reserves, about half of which came from the United States, to help stabilize those global oil prices. At the same time, there's no getting around it. As long as we are reliant on these sources of fuel, we are impacted by this volatility, these shocks that happen. It could be half a world away, and it could still hit us in our pocketbook and our family budget at the pump right here in the United States.
So you mentioned electric vehicles. Really quickly, the average price for one of those is around $50,000 or so. So that's still out of reach for a lot of Americans. How are we even going to reach that point of this, how we imagine this cleaner, greener world?
Well, I would say a couple of things. First of all, we have proposals to buy down the cost of electric vehicles by more than $10,000 in tax incentives. The House supported it. We're hoping that at least a couple of Republicans would be willing to get on board with getting Americans a $10,000, $12,000 price break on those electric vehicles to make them more affordable. Although I would also mention a second thing. These averages are getting thrown around. And let's be clear, those averages count luxury cars too. Look, you can get an excellent electric pickup truck, for example, made in the U.S. for high 30s, low 40s. Still out of reach for too many families, which is why we're trying to reduce that price point. But you can already save a lot of money if you are able to afford an electric car, because it's cheaper to maintain, cheaper to own, and cheaper to fill up, which is exactly why we need to be doing everything we can to make electric vehicles more affordable and to put out those chargers across the country that give everyone who's considering buying one confidence that they can get where they need to go. The range on these things is pretty good, 200, 300, 400 miles, but depending on your pattern of life, you may really be counting on those chargers in between your home and where you need to go.
And in light of the price of gas right now, you may see more folks turning to EVs. It's just a smarter and potentially cheaper opportunity. Mr. Secretary, you also had talked about the federal gas tax as a means of helping pay for some infrastructure spending. Gas prices obviously right now kind of off the charts. This could go on for a couple of months according to the experts. So is raising that tax, at least in your mind, an option still on the table?
Well, we're definitely not talking about raising taxes. There are different proposals out there for tax relief. And look, we're going to continue seeing a lot of options floated. But let's remember, we are dealing with the immediate situation and also playing a long game where we need to be building the kind of infrastructure that's going to give us alternatives when it comes to energy, give us alternatives when it comes to getting around. Not only do we want Americans to have the ability to afford and use a great electric vehicle, but we also want to make sure that you don't have to bring 2 tons of metal with you everywhere you go, by ensuring that there are excellent options for transit available to Americans. It's part of why under the American Rescue Plan, we just released another $2.2 billion to shore up some of the transit agencies that were so hard hit during the pandemic. And now we're supporting them moving toward cleaner vehicles that also save taxpayer dollars, because they're often cheaper to maintain and fuel as well.
So let's talk about the infrastructure bill here. So far, the signature legislation of the Biden administration. So what are some of the projects that Americans will see that will change their lives with that money? And again, let's focus on the ones that we can actually physically see and see quickly.
That's right. We've already put about $50 billion out on the roads and bridges side, and there's more where that came from. What's that going to mean for you? You're going to notice more road repairs going on close to where you live. You're going to notice a lot more bridges being fixed, whether you have a bridge that's out completely, or a lot of times you'll see that sign that says there's a load limit because the bridge is in poor condition. That means trucks can't go over it. That, in turn, makes it more complicated to get deliveries where they need to go. And that's a supply chain issue that increases, ultimately, our prices and ability to get things at grocery stores. So all of these things are connected, and you're going to see this in ways that are noticeable and in ways that are a little more subtle. You're going to see a better ability to get goods where they need to be. You look at something like transit, that benefits you even if you drive your own car and you don't use transit, because there will be less congestion on the roads. And these projects, some of which will be underway this year, are going to continue through this entire decade. You know, we're also talking about large bridges. We're talking about airports that need to be redesigned. So many infrastructure projects that will take a few years to complete, but then will define what it's like to move around America, literally for the rest of our lives.
Mm-hmm. And listen, with some of these projects, obviously, it takes a while to see things come into action. They're environmental studies, and you have to get the money in place and the hiring and the plans. We understand that it takes a while. Yeah. But in terms of actual ground being broken, dirt being moved, cranes in the sky, what is your expectation for when we'll see that first project, what it will be, where it will be? When will folks say, there's that $1 trillion that got the bipartisan support on Capitol Hill? When do we get a visual here?
Well, look, a lot of it's going to be happening this year, right? Some of the projects are ready to go. The only thing that's been holding them up is funding, and we just solved that for some of the states or communities that are trying to make things happen. I think you will see chargers being installed. You'll see roads being repaired. You'll see some of those things moving more quickly. And by the way, projects that have been developed over a long time that we have underway now through programs that are only going to grow further. But again, I want to emphasize, this isn't just about, what are we going to see this week? This is about how, for the rest of the 21st century, America will be able to compete and win, because we are doing the things in the 2020s that we probably should have been done in the 1990s. That's why there's not a moment to lose.
So when I lived in a few different states, and some of those states have had barely any infrastructure for public transportation. So a lot of cars on the road, some of them didn't even have buses, honestly. And so how can improving this infrastructure here, or even improving the buses that we do have and the trains and transit systems, how is that going to affect the larger picture of climate change that we're dealing with right now every day?
Well, look, transportation is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our economy. And to me, that is a challenge for us to try to be the biggest part of the solution, too. Whether we're talking about making vehicles cleaner, whether we're talking about making shipping cleaner, which is also a big deal and something that we're doing a lot of work on, reducing the pollution that goes into our air, or just giving people options. Transit is not just for the biggest cities. A lot of rural transit agencies are some of our best partners in helping people get around. I think there's a lot of innovation coming to transit too. It's not just the big buses now, but you see some transit authorities thinking about things that are almost halfway like a Uber or a Lyft in terms of getting that last mile delivery, people where they need to be, and then connecting them into a bigger system. I expect a lot of innovation across the 2020s on this. And then you're also going to see things like automation increasingly coming into transportation in this decade. That's going to affect how people get around a great deal too.
And Mr. Secretary, before we let you go, I do want to kind of take a sharp turn here to kind of get into a different story that's been in the headlines. Listen, I think it's pretty unarguable that you are definitely the highest profile openly gay public leader in the country. And when you look at some of the headlines right now, like what critics call the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, you look at certain laws going into effect in Iowa and Indiana, where you used to be a mayor, as you well know, there in your state there, that dealing with trans athletes. What message do you get from what's happening in those states, and what would you tell young students they should get from what is happening, at least in certain pockets of our country? I would imagine this is an issue you would feel deeply about.
Yeah, what we see here, I think, is frankly a lot of politics at the expense of some of our most vulnerable kids. Whether it's this Don't Say Gay bill that just passed in Florida that Chasten and I, my husband and I, have been talking about what that would mean if our kids were a little older and we lived in Florida. If they came in Monday morning and kids were talking about their weekend and they said, "Oh, we just had the best weekend. Our dads took us to the zoo and we got ice cream." Would a teacher have to say, "Oh, no, we don't talk about that in here"? In Texas, they're talking about turning in parents for being supportive of their transgender kids, when we know that supportive parents is one of the things that can help us beat back the horrifyingly high level of suicide attempts and rates among LGBTQ youth. So what we see right now, I think, frankly, is politics. It's the ugliest kind of politics. And as long as there's been politics, there have been some who think they can reap a political reward by picking a fight on people who are vulnerable. My message to those people who are vulnerable, to those kids who know that they're a little different, that wonder whether they're going to fit in, is that a lot of people are rooting for you to succeed. I'm rooting for you to succeed. You have a president who has your back. And these kinds of cynical political attacks, they're not going to carry the day in the long run. They're just not.
Yeah, definitely thinking about all of those kids, too. So switching gears a bit here as well, the president announced plans to help veterans exposed to toxic chemicals from things like burn pits get better health benefits and treatment. So, Secretary, you are a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. Can you talk with us a little bit about what care was like when you left the service and what this bill could do for veterans? We only have about a minute left here.
Yeah, this is a really important issue. When I was deployed in Afghanistan, I remember folks around the base saying, just breathing the air there is about the same as smoking a pack of cigarettes every day. Wow. I'm not stating that as a scientific fact. That was just kind of what people would say around the base. But what is a scientific fact is that people who have been in and around these burn pits where a lot of things were incinerated have much higher exposure and risk of cancer. And if we're serious about taking care of our veterans, we got to be serious about taking care of vets who were exposed. That's exactly what the president is leading us toward doing, called for it in the State of the Union speech. It's an example of something that I hope is not at all a Republican or Democrat issue. It's just doing right by people who served. I served my tour. Some of the people I was with served 5, 6, or 7 times in Iraq and Afghanistan. I know what they were exposed to, and that commitment, that promise we have to make to take care of them, that's not just as long as you're in uniform. That's as long as you live, because these are people who put their lives on the line for this country.
Yeah.
Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us here on Morning Rush on Newsy. Certainly appreciate your time, and please come back when you can.
Thank you. Good to be with you.